Well, those of you who hadn't any kind of anticipation last week of what I might talk about might have been a little surprised. Hopefully not in a negative sense, but in a positive one. The way in which we read the scripture is important. We can easily have preconceived ideas, and that's not surprising, particularly if you've grown up hearing Bible verses and read and explained. And sometimes it just becomes a bit of a habit to say, well, yes, I know how to understand that instinctively. Well, those of you who know me reasonably well know that that's not how I think. It's not the way my brain works. And in the case of the Gospel of John, I think most of us would have always felt this is something really different and special. The other three have a very similar style, but John's clearly not following that type of presentation. And for me, then, the question immediately is why? Why is it so different? So last week, particularly if you weren't here or haven't in the meantime watched the video of this, we looked at, first of all, how close John was related to Jesus, to John the Baptist as well, and his brother James, of course, a very close relationship. And that comes out in the gospel record frequently. And you might remember that Peter, James and John were one of the three very closest disciples to Jesus. So what we tried to emphasise last time was that it's important to read all of the New Testament from a Jewish perspective. All the writers were Jews. Most of them lived in the land. They were familiar with their Hebrew scriptures because the New Testament hadn't been written yet. And so we must recognise that flavour, if you like, that we need to notice as we read it. John wasn't written in the year 300 within a Greek environment, so therefore we should not read it like as if it was. We've emphasised, based on Galatians 2 particularly, that John is written to Jewish people in the diaspora throughout the Roman Empire. Not to Gentiles, although Gentiles no doubt read it as we do, but it was written in that context. And I emphasise too that we must not read it, in my view, as written against or in the context of Gnostic thinking, partly because they didn't exist in the first century, so it would have been pretty difficult for John to write in that context. But the reason why various people over the years, theologians, even some brethren, have assumed that it was in the context of Gnosticism is because prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in particular, no one knew this kind of language and style that John was presenting. It seemed to fit a Greek thinking context. But with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and other documents since the Second World War, it's become quite obvious that no, this style of thinking and language is very much a Jewish way in the first century. It's not a later Greek kind of thinking. And that therefore means that when you read John, and the whole New Testament of course, we must think of it in that background that those 3 dot points illustrate. Now, the timing, perhaps not critical to the case, but I think my understanding of this is that it was probably written before AD 70, and that fits the general language and context that I've already been emphasising. And we're not going into this, and we didn't last time either, but just to note the point that the context, the flavour, the way in which John's written and the way James's letter is written, it has a lot in common. There's a similar direct Hebrew style. And James wrote before AD 62, when approximately then is when he died. So all of that was last time. Now this time we're going to get into, as the first slide showed, looking at how accurate in detailed geography and customs and so on John is, which really emphasises that he was an eyewitness. He was the John that we read of in the Gospels elsewhere. He was the one who was one of the first disciples called. He was therefore with Jesus for the whole period of his ministry, which I think was 3.5 years. I know there are other alternatives to that, but for the whole period, no other gospel writer was, as we noted last time. So, first of all, John 21 quite plainly says, in slightly cryptic language, because John is not wanting to put himself forward and say, well, you know, I'm a clever fellow, so you have to believe what I say. So he doesn't use his own name anywhere, which I can understand. But in John 21 verse 24, this makes it reasonably obvious, I think. We won't go back over the previous verses, but it's talking about Jesus after he's been raised from the dead and talking to the apostles. Verse 24, this is the disciple, I think that means me in this sense, who testifies of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And there are also many other things that Jesus did, which if they were written one by one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Amen. So John's stressing the fact that I can, as it were, he's saying, I can vouch for this. I was there. I saw these things. I heard these things. You can take my word for it. That's essentially what he's saying. And you get similar kind of language in 1 John, which we won't turn up. Now, as I said before, Peter, James and John were often the only ones to witness particular events. An example is the Transfiguration. So if we read the Bible as written by people who were there and knew what they were talking about, not hand-me-down information, not relying on much later inspiration about something they had no personal knowledge of, then it's clear that John has to be written by one of those three. That would be a very obvious conclusion. And John is the one that's reasonably obvious, the case in the Gospel of John. And of all of the 12, he was the only one who wrote a gospel. That's interesting. What I mean by that is the only one who was from the beginning able to write the whole of the gospel, because as we saw last time, Matthew and Mark did have some experience in the ministry, but not the whole period. The other thing that comes out very importantly too is that John almost entirely chooses events that occurred in Jerusalem, not in Galilee or Samaria or somewhere else. Samaria, there is an exception to that. But broadly speaking, he's not like the others who are saying, well, Jesus went from here to there, you know, you can trace it on a map. John's very much focused on Jerusalem, and I think there's an important reason for that. Jerusalem was the headquarters of the religious leaders of the time. It was where the temple was. And so Jesus needed to establish his credentials there primarily. That, and he knew too, that's where he would be crucified. So there's a very deliberate selection of events by John that builds that picture, very focused picture, based on Jerusalem almost entirely. Now, I'm going to run through these reasonably quickly. We really don't have time to look them all up, but I want you to get an impression from these 15 or so examples that you're going to see quickly shown. First of all, he was quite familiar with the territory of Palestine. He talks about going down from Cana to Capernaum. Now, if it was written much later and he wasn't an eyewitness, he was relying on information from others, or if you want to look at it from an extremely sceptical point of view, making it up, a lot of these details would not be there or not be correct, but they are. So going down from Cana to Capernaum is exactly what it is like. And going up to Jerusalem is, of course, the opposite picture, absolutely correct. He talks about money changes in the temple. So you can start to see he's very particular in describing details that you could argue may not always be essential to the record, but they just simply reflect the fact that he was there, he did see and hear what he writes about, and he's very familiar with the way things were. Talks about much water at Enon near Salem. Talks about Jacob's well being near Samaria or Sychar. Not in it, but near it, and it is exactly that. The sheep gate in Jerusalem and the pool of Bethesda with 5 porches. You start to get this sense of it's very specific, very particular. Boats that were large enough on the Sea of Galilee to take 13 men. Think about that. He could have very easily described a situation where everyone would go, well, that's rubbish because there aren't any boats bigger than that would take half a dozen. But they found one not that long ago in Israel. They're buried underwater in mud that is clearly big enough to take 13 men. So that's correct. Talks in detail about the pool of Siloam. And that's been only recently uncovered in the land. They used to show you a pool that they said was a pool of Siloam, but in fact it's known now that that wasn't actually constructed till centuries later, but they have found the 1st century one. And the picture that presents fits exactly the record. A lot of detail in chapter 10 of John about the custom of how sheep were looked after and how they behaved and what shepherds did or didn't do. Very familiar with that. He knew by personal experience that it was at least 2 days' journey from Bethabara to Bethany when he went to raise Lazarus. That Bethany, and this is how precise it is 15 stadia, roughly 3 kilometres to us, from Jerusalem. You see this kind of detail. You might say, well, we didn't need to know that. Doesn't matter exactly how close Bethany is to Jerusalem, but it's just, he's saying it because it was natural for him to describe it like this. Talks about the brook Kedron near Jerusalem, where the Garden of Gethsemane was. Then we look at the next slide, 3 slides, about things that were in John's record not mentioned in the other 3 at all. There's quite a list. John, Andrew, Simon, Peter, Philip and Nathanael called by Jesus to be his disciples. Note this in chapter 1. Excuse me. It was hiding last week and I had to battle on not thinking there was one here, but it turned out to be behind me. Anyway, we haven't time to actually read those verses, but it's pretty clear to me that the first few verses of there show that John and Andrew were the first 2 selected. They were disciples of John the Baptist, and he said, well, you should go and follow this man, not me. Water turned to wine in Cana, not mentioned in the other 3 gospel records. the driving out of the money changers from the temple, the first occasion of that. His conversation with Nicodemus, a really significant section of Scripture. John the Baptist's dispute with the Jews. Jesus going through Samaria, healing the nobleman's son, healing at the pool of Bethesda. Jesus walking on water. Jesus' discourse on the bread of life. Jesus at the Feast of Tabernacles, at the Feast of Dedication. None of these mentioned in the other records. The raising of Lazarus from the dead, an incredible miracle, not mentioned by the others. He records the occasion of Greek-speaking Jews wanting to see Jesus. This is the diaspora people. So you can see how well that fits the scenario I put to you last time, that those readers would pick that up and go, oh yeah, that's people we know, or people like me who went to see Jesus. So it's very appropriate. Washing the disciples' feet. The betrayal of Judas Iscariot, there's details there not in the others. His discourse in the upper room, most of that's not mentioned in the other records. His discourse and prayer on the way to Gethsemane. His discourse and prayer. So what that's telling us is that John records more of the actual words of Jesus, including long discourses, more than any of the other gospel writers. It's a significant feature of John. Chapters of word for word what Jesus was saying in great detail. But let's continue on, because that's the end of that section of Jesus' discourses. The detail of Jesus before Pilate, of the women who witnessed the crucifixion, of Jesus saying on the cross, I thirst, the death of Jesus confirmed by the soldiers. And so all of these things are distinctive to John. Now, if John had, by himself or a later hand, manipulated all this to make it fit exactly the style of the other three, you might well start to think, this may be just copying, may not really be a genuine gospel. But because of its uniqueness, it actually strengthens the argument that it is entirely reliable. Now, to explain in our next section what is the purpose of John's writing is easy, because he tells us. John 20, verse 31. Is spelled out absolutely plainly. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. Now, if you think of this as being written to the Jewish diaspora, that's exactly what you would say. He's saying, I want you to be convinced, as I am, that Jesus is the Messiah, that you may believe this. They obviously didn't yet believe it. He wouldn't have said that you may believe it if they already did. So it's written to people who had no direct experience with the life of Jesus because they didn't live in the land. And so John is writing to these dispersed Jews around the Roman Empire saying, let me tell you exactly what it was all like. I was there, I saw it, heard it, and here's what I've written. And I want you to believe just like I do, and just like many others in the land do, because they saw it and heard it. And that's what he wants them to believe. That Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ. And again, that fits exactly the point. They may well have heard that Jesus was a remarkable person, but the whole point that John's trying to say is this man is the promised Messiah, the one spoken of throughout the Old Testament. I want you to believe that he is that man. He's not just a prophet. He's not just a wise man. He is the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of God. And of course, if you do believe, he's saying, then you'll have life in his name. I'm not going into explain that. That's another detailed area. So he's trying to convince those who as yet don't believe. The difference when we come to his first letter is really interesting, but so is the fact that it's almost the same wording, but not quite. So look at what he says when he writes to the people who read his first letter, 1 John 5:13. These things, see the language is so similar, these things I have written to you who believe. So they are believers. In the name of the Son of God, that you may know that you have eternal life. So this is clearly written to assure those who already believed. See the difference? But the similar language. Son of God is mentioned in both. Life is mentioned in both. Belief is mentioned in both. So it really reinforces the obvious point that it's the same writer. And he's turned his attention from people who don't believe in his gospel to people who do believe in his letter. Now, how does he prove this? How does he establish that Jesus is the Messiah? Well, what he doesn't do, which Matthew tends to do a lot more, is quote Old Testament prophecies and then show you that that's fulfilled. He takes a somewhat different approach, and I think it's a very interesting one, because what he describes Jesus as, in my words and the words, similar words from many writers, he's the revealer of God. He is the one who is showing everybody what God is like. I think that's a really interesting way to read it and to think about. He is not saying, I'm God. He's not saying, I'm just a prophet. He's not even saying very often, I'm the Messiah, although he does. He's really stressing, look at me, I'm like God. Now, of course, to his unbelieving Jews in the land, that was not on. And so they killed him for it. But think about it this way. And here's a theologian who tells us that John 1:1, often used to say there's a Trinity, he says, no, it doesn't. It means that the Word was an expression, or note this term, reflection of God. He's saying, no, he's not. John is not saying Jesus is God. He's saying he's an expression or a reflection of him. And that's not a Christadelphian saying that. It's a fairly standard, if you like, theologian. Here's another one, Barclay, very familiar name to many of you, written a lot of interesting commentaries on the New Testament. When John said the Word was God, he was not saying that Jesus was identical with God. He was saying that Jesus was so perfectly the same as God in mind, in heart, in being, that in him we perfectly see what God is like. It's a really lovely way of putting it, but again, written by a person who is a mainline Christian theologian. So when we start reading through John, which I'm going to flick through a number of verses quickly now, with that in mind, just pick up this style of way John presents Jesus, some often in Jesus' own words. The only begotten Son who is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him. He is showing people what God is like. Whatever the Son sees the Father do, so he does in like manner. And that's a very common way of looking at it. If any of you men here have had a son, then you know that's exactly how it works. And same with girls and their mums, usually. They learn from very small age to copy and try to replicate what they see their parent doing. And Jesus was no different. but his Father was God. And so, as he says, what I see the Father, he saw what the Father was doing, and he said, I'm doing the same things that God does. Jesus says, if you had known me, you would have known my Father also. Fits the picture, doesn't it? I and my Father are one. Absolutely. The Father is in me and I in him. He who sees me sees him who sent me. And we'll look at the importance of sent in a moment. He who receives me receives him who sent me. He who has seen me has seen the Father. I am in the Father and the Father in me. I have manifested your name, that they may be one as we are. You see that all of those are saying the same kind of thing, just a slightly different way of saying it. They're all emphasising that he fully represented God. When you listened to him and you saw what he did, you could know exactly that's what God is like. That's what the New Testament is telling us, and John in particular. Now, I mentioned this word sent. It's used a couple of times on that slide there. It's called the law of agency. Not perhaps a term you've heard, but it's a well-known thing to those who've studied the times of the New Testament and the Old Testament. There was a thing, not just in the Jewish people, but in the nations around. There was a concept of the law of agency. You could almost use the equivalent of saying the idea that an ambassador is there to represent their country some thousands of miles away maybe. So that person is given the authority by their home country to be in another country and say, I am representing that country. I am the agent, the representative of that country. And just let me show you some examples in the Old Testament. The angel that appeared to Abraham was representing God. He uses God's name to demonstrate that. The angel wasn't God. He wasn't Yahweh of the Old Testament, the Hebrew term for God. But he used that word because he fully represented, had all the authority that God had delegated to him for these purposes. And you pick it up in Moses as well, in Exodus 3. Abraham's servant who goes off to do what Abraham wants. He fully represented Abraham. He was given authority to do certain things on his behalf. And Joseph, similarly. Moses. Then we come to the 12 apostles. When they were sent off to do their preaching and miracles, they were representing, using the name of Jesus, their Lord. Romans 13 talks about governments being effectively appointed by God, and we should obey them because they represent what God wants them to do. Not always that we agree with, but that's the point the apostle's making. And Jesus, very plainly in a number of passages, was fully representing, had all the authority that God gave him, whether it's the power to raise people from the dead in the past, but also when he returns. They're all examples of the kind of authority Jesus had from his Father. So Jesus and John described this on a number of occasions. Jesus spoke God's words. He did what the Father showed him. God gave him the authority to judge. He was sent by God. So let's look at this one because it's the word sent that I talked about a moment ago, and another one after that one. So first of all, John 6 verse 35. There are lots of examples of being sent, but I just want you to pick up one or two. And in fact, I might have got the wrong verse there. I'll read it anyway. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger. He who believes in me shall never thirst. It's obviously not the one I meant to quote you, unless I can... 39.
And 40.
Great, yes, thank you. Yep, so if you're writing that down, don't write that down over there. Write the correct one. Verse 39, this is the will of the Father who sent me, that of all he has given me, so you can see how God has transferred things to him, I should lose nothing but should raise it up at the last day. And this is the will of him who sent me, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up at the last day. So he's clearly saying, well, I'm the one, like an ambassador. The Father has sent me to talk to you people. And in 13, hopefully I got it right this time, 13 verse 16. Most assuredly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. So Jesus is saying what would have been easily understood at that time. Well, if I've been sent, well, I am clearly not superior to the one who sent me. I'm very much secondary to him. I'm simply his representative. I'm not the same as the one who sent me, because no one who'd been sent was the same person as the one who sent them. That just doesn't make sense. They were a delegated person. And let me just quote you a couple of theologians. This is a little bit complex, but I want you to be assured that I'm not just missing the point of what is commonly understood by experts in reading language in the Bible. Two references to other people here. Borgen and Harvey explain that during antiquity, agency was practiced widely in business and law in the Near East, including in Israel. Here's how it worked. A man as principal would select a man as a reliable agent, delegate his authority to him, and send him out as his representative to speak and or act on his behalf. So this is the law of agency. You can see how perfectly that fits all those references we've looked at. The one sent thus becomes the embodiment of the authority of the sender. A man's agency was like himself. So, to be in the presence of a man's agent was like being in the presence of that man himself. It's exactly the way we've been seeing the New Testament, and John in particular, presents Jesus. Jacob Jervell insists that the idea of God sending Jesus must be understood from a Jewish rather than a Hellenistic or Greek perspective, because the Greeks thought in metaphysical and ontological ways. I'm not going into that anymore, but you see how this particular writer is saying it's very different from the way the Greeks thought, the way they wrote. It's entirely consistent with the way Jews thought and how they built that on the Old Testament Hebrew concepts. Recall that the author of the fourth Gospel, John, is a Jew writing to Jews. Jervell contends that for Jews, God sending the Messiah merely meant that he delegated full divine authority to him. Doesn't mean Jesus is God at all. And Jervell rightly asserts, it is a misunderstanding to believe that the Gospel of John makes Jesus into God or identical with God. The Gospel permits the Jews to bring the accusation of blasphemy against Jesus, that is, that he equates himself with God in John 5:18. This criticism is pushed aside in the Gospel. And Jesus said, well, that's ridiculous. You don't know your own Bibles, and just dismissed that claim that they put to him that he's making himself equal with God. He was doing no such thing. Jesus is not God, but God's representative, and as such, so completely and totally acts on God's behalf that he stands in God's stead before the world. And that's very different from anyone else ever mentioned in the Bible. Lots of people, like prophets in the Old Testament, were sent by God and they represented him, but not like this man Jesus. Not to the full extent that he did. In every detail of his life, his actions, his words, fully reflected God to the people. That's how we need to read the gospel. Now, I'm going to throw in something here which you might go, well, what's that got to do with tonight's talk? But I think, hopefully, you'll see that it's connected. And that's Antichrist. Where does that come into the story? Now, you're probably aware it's only in John's first letter that it's and second, that it's mentioned at all. It's not in the gospel. But remember, they're the same writer. 1 John 2:18 says that there are many antichrists had come, not just one. So there's a class of people John is describing as antichrist, not just one person, and not just in the future, but already in John's time. Chapter 2, verse 22, they denied that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah. That's exactly what John said he'd written his gospel to prove. But they didn't agree with it. And who didn't agree with it? The Jewish authorities. They didn't believe that he was the promised Jewish Messiah. 1 John 4, verse 3, and this is a telling one. Jesus, this Antichrist says, did not come in the flesh. Well, that's an interesting expression. Again, in 2 John verse 7, Jesus did not come in the flesh, they said. And we only have to go back to John himself in chapter 3, speaking to Nicodemus. Flesh represents one who is fully human, could, like any other human, sin if they chose to. We won't go back and look at that. But Jesus says, whatever is born of flesh is flesh. He wasn't just saying almost kindergarten sort of language. Well, obviously, if you're born of flesh, you are flesh. Didn't need to say that. What he's saying is, if you are a human being born of flesh, then you have all of the characteristics of humans. And Jesus did, including being able to sin. But he didn't, of course, whereas everyone else like us does. The Jews at the time of the New Testament did not expect the Messiah to be a normal human man. They did not believe that he would be born of someone like Mary. They had all sorts of funny ideas, but they know he's not just a normal human being. Somehow he's outside of that realm. That's how they believed the Messiah would be. And that's how Trinitarians today think as well. They don't believe that Jesus was a normal human being with all of the capacities and foibles and potentials of humans, but he didn't sin. And so that's why they often find, they think, reasons to believe that Jesus was God, particularly in John's Gospel. But if you look at it from the point of view that John himself is writing to Jews who were yet to believe, then that whole concept disappears. Now I want us to look at just two verses that are often stumbling blocks and we might find sometimes difficult to explain. The first one is this term in John 8, if you have a look at this one. John 8, verse 58. Jesus said to them, most assuredly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. And if you've got a Bible like mine, I am is in capitals, as if to say this is something really special. It's language that's unusual and is hinting that there's something more than just the superficial language here. And I'm just looking down to see what my marginal note has here, if I can pick it out, which I can't quickly. But if you might find in yours, there might be a marginal reference, perhaps back to Exodus, where God's name was given. Well, I know this is getting a bit technical, but bear with me if you can. The words I am there in the Greek are ego eimi. That's what those two words in Greek are. Ego is I, me. Eimi is I am. It's a little bit similar to English if you think about it, because English is derived a lot from Greek language anyway. Well, what about this expression then? Is it taken from Exodus? Well, in one sense it looks like it could be. In the Greek translation, the Septuagint of Exodus 3:14, the black highlighted area shows you that yes, ego eimi is in that verse. Aha! So is he in fact quoting that? Well, you may not be able to decipher the rest of it, but the Greek translation is somewhat different to the Hebrew. It doesn't say I am that I am, as the English translation of the Hebrew might put it. It says in English, I am the being. I am the being. So ego eimi is not repeated as I am that I am. It's I am the being, which is roughly pronounced ho on. Excuse me. And the bottom line there that I've highlighted in the English Bible, it will say, you've got to tell the people of Israel, I am has sent me, is God's name, sorry. I am is his name. But the Greek translates, the being is his name, not I am at all. So, I know that's a bit tricky, but if John 8 was quoting the Septuagint Greek translation to show that Jesus was in fact God, it would have said, before Abraham was the being, I am, in other words, God. But that isn't what is quoted. It's the other part of that verse, which is, in fact, the perfectly normal language to say I am, in any context you like. And we'll see that in a moment when I turn to another verse, actually perhaps on the same pages that you've got open at the moment. Okay, so if, as I said, Jesus was meant to be saying that he was God, he would have said that he was the being, the ho-on, but he didn't. Now, have a look at chapter 9, verse 9. And this is the occasion of the man born blind who was given sight by Jesus. And people were rather confused because they couldn't believe that he'd suddenly been able to see when he hadn't been able to see since he was born. It wasn't a recent ailment that suddenly got better. You could almost say he was born without eyes. In other words, he couldn't see from birth. And so this was an extraordinary miracle to give this man sight. And if you look at verse 8, therefore the neighbours and those who previously had seen that he was blind said, is this not he who sat and begged? Some said, this is he. Others said, in effect, oh, he can't be him. He's like him. And the man says, I am he. Exactly the same term. The he is made up. If you've got Bible that shows this. It's in italics, perhaps. It is in mine. So Jesus says, I am. The man born blind says, I am. It's not a peculiar expression. No one said, you can't say that. That's like saying you're God, because it didn't mean that. It didn't mean that at all. And it didn't mean that when he said it. It didn't mean that when Jesus said it. And we'll see, and maybe you've made the connection already, the whole point of John's record, as he himself says, I'm recording these events to show you that Jesus is the Messiah, and that's what Jesus meant. Before Abraham was, I'm the Messiah, I'm the one promised, I'm the one from the beginning that God had in mind. I'm him, the one that was to come, the Messiah. But he just said, I am, just like the man born blind said, I am. It's an affirmation, simply saying, yes, that's correct. So, that's how I deal with that tricky one in John 8. The other one is the expression used by Thomas in chapter 20, verse 28, where he says, my Lord and my God. In fact, apart from John 1, verse 1, many theologians say that one and this one are the only real clear statements that Jesus is God. Just these two. They acknowledge that none of the other often used verses, they don't really prove Jesus is God at all, but those two do. We've already dealt with John 1:1. It doesn't say that at all, according to theologians. So we're left with one, just one verse in the whole New Testament that appears to be saying that Jesus is God. Appears to. Well, first of all, it was said by Thomas. Now, that doesn't mean he's wrong. It's just, well, hang on. It's just Thomas. It's not a divine statement from Jesus or from an angel or from wherever. This is Thomas's response. And so in the whole New Testament, the whole Bible, it's just these words of Thomas that appear to suggest Jesus was God. Well, first of all, he used the term my Lord. Now, that's just the normal way people address Jesus. There's nothing divine about that word at all. In fact, Thomas himself used it back in chapter 14, which I won't turn up. So, in other words, it's the normal way they address Jesus. Roughly, I suppose, a bit like being very respectful and referring to someone as sir. And if you've mixed with Americans a lot, you'll notice they often use that expression. We don't. It seems to us to be probably more like referring to someone who's been knighted by the Queen. But for many people in America, it's just a normal, respectful form of address. And that's how it was in the New Testament. So saying to Jesus, my Lord, that's not proving anything as far as implying in any way that Jesus was God. So that leaves us with this other expression. What did he mean when he said, my God? Well, this is interesting because if you just go back to verse 17, you'll see that this particular language Jesus used himself when he spoke to Mary after his resurrection. 20 verse 17, do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, my God and your God. So Jesus is saying this term, my God, I'm talking about the Father in heaven. That's what I mean when I use the term my God. So just a few verses later on, Thomas uses exactly the same expression. Does he mean something different? Well, that would be a bit hard to explain. Why would John record something that's so close together in the New Testament but mean entirely different things? I put it to you that he wouldn't do that. So whatever Thomas was implying has to be understood in the context, not just of the whole of Gospel of John, but just a few verses earlier, that this term was referring to the Father. So, well, what do we make of that? As well, Jesus often referred to his Father in that language, but in John 17, in his prayer, he talks about him being the only true God. So that's what Jesus understood about the term Father and God, that it was referring to this one individual. We've seen already that John's purpose is to show, John 20:31 that we looked at earlier, that Jesus is the Son of God. That's his purpose. It would be unusual if he then suddenly changed direction and said, well, I'm now going to show you that he's not just the Son of God, he's actually God himself. That would not fit, wouldn't make sense. So what was Thomas saying? Well, he was saying, when he saw the risen Lord, my Lord and my God. He's praising and extolling both his Lord, Jesus, and the Father, my God. We don't have to read those two terms as both referring to Jesus. We naturally might, but it doesn't logically follow that we should. So, who did Jesus claim to be? Well, here's a long list of verses which we won't look up, but just think about these collectively. When Jesus spoke, what did he mean by himself? What did he say? This is who I am. Well, we can certainly say he never said, I'm God. That was what Thomas used, that expression, but Jesus didn't. He said many, many times, not just in John, I'm the Son of Man. It's fairly common to say, well, that just means I am a human being. Well, it doesn't. And that's pretty obvious when you think about it. It's a term used in Daniel 7 as a term for the Messiah. And at his trial, that's exactly what he said. He said at his trial, quoting Daniel 7, you will see one like the Son of Man coming in clouds. That's me, he says. This is the title of the Messiah. It's not just a term to say, well, he was a human. So over and over again, he talks about God being his Father, my Father, not just the Father, but my Father. And he's told us that we can refer to God like that too. What an incredible privilege that is. He emphasises over and over again, he's the Son of God, the only begotten Son of God. He was heir to the temple because when he was there, he said, this is my Father's house and I'm going to inherit it, because sons always inherit what their fathers have. As a general comment, obviously some people write their wills so that doesn't happen, but in the general course of events, that's the way it goes. Very plainly, he says, not just that he is Christ, but he uses the word, uniquely in John, the Messiah. That's nowhere else used, but except in those occasions. The term Messiah, which is equivalent to Christ, Hebrew and Greek for the same thing. He says he's the bread of life, the light of the world, the door of the sheep, the door into the sheepfold for the sheep to be protected. He's the good shepherd. He's the resurrection and the life. He's a teacher and Lord. He's the way, the truth and the life. He's the true vine. He's the King, which is essentially the idea of Christ or Messiah. And it was no accident that when he was crucified, what was written? "This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews," or literally the King of the Judeans. This was his territory. He is the king, even as he's been crucified and about to die. So very quickly, a whole summary of both nights. John was a cousin of Jesus, second cousin of John the Baptist. His initial audience was unbelieving Jews in the diaspora. He wrote before AD 70. He was an eyewitness from the beginning. He was very familiar with the geography of the land in the first century. His gospel contains much that is unique to his record, which supports its genuineness. He recorded much more of Jesus' actual words than all of the others. He shows that Jesus represented God to his people as God's agent. And as John himself says, his purpose was to show that Jesus was the Messiah. And as Leon wishes me to say, thank you for your attention.